I'm here to suggest a fun little game you can try out on Halloween night or any other evening where the theme is chills and thrills. It's played only by a few insiders who know all its rules and aspects, but I thought it wouldn't be a bad idea to spread it a little more. It's called the Game of Nerve. You'll quickly understand why, although I would have preferred another name for it. Just avoid playing it if you're not in good physical shape, because there's a good chance you'll have to sprint at some point. The game is much more fun when you play it with several people. Now I'm going to explain the preparation rules to you. Easy to prepare. A place that must be permanently lit and bright enough so that your men don't touch anything else at all, except for the participants' own. Ideally, try to completely empty a room so that no object produces even a small one, or play outdoors with a powerful light source. Second point, make sure to have a flashlight for each person there. On the contrary, it shouldn't be powerful enough to separate your shadow from the darkness. Third point, wait until night falls. The exact time doesn't matter much, as long as it's completely dark. If possible, try to avoid pitch black nights. Prefer those that get at least a little moonlight. This is for your safety, but after that, you can do as you wish. Number 4, the little detail not to overlook, make sure you know the area around the place where you'll be playing very well. This is simply to avoid unexpected obstacles. Don't forget that a good part of the game takes place in rather poor visibility conditions. It would be foolish for someone to get hurt because of a bad fall. Little 5. Once all of this is done and you are gathered in the lit area, leave it and move at least 200 meters away from it. For beginners, that should be enough. Those who are used to it prefer to move away until they can no longer see it. Some people who play with an electric light source even go so far as to turn it off when they leave. There's no need to be too daring at first, simply moving away will be enough. Little 6, also move away from all the participants, so that you can't touch them or even see them. But make sure that everyone can hear everyone. Turn on all your lamps, the game can begin. The Game of Nerve is about challenging the people of the shadows by claiming you're stronger than they are. To do this, just follow these steps. Turn off your lamp and say loudly enough for everyone to hear. You must say, "People of the shadows, king of the night, your power is nothing compared to mine." As soon as these words have been spoken, run as fast as you can toward the light and position yourself so that your shadow does not meet any other. You have exactly 3 minutes to reach the light, not a second more. Having a stopwatch to check the remaining time isn't a bad idea. If you go past that time, the shadow people will have caught you and you'll become one of them. Don't play with fire and don't try to see what happens if you stay in the shadows for more than 3 minutes. There are several versions about this, with 2 that are the most common. The first says that your shadow becomes the host of a member of the shadow people, and that it will torment you with auditory and visual hallucinations, driving you to madness and suicide. After that, it will be able to detach from you and rejoin its people. The other version says that in any case, those who go beyond 3 minutes never reach the light source. Whether it's one or the other, there's no point in trying to find out. The point of playing with several people is that the person who says the word emo isn't chosen beforehand. So it could be anyone. Everyone who hasn't said anything must also turn off their lamps when they hear them. But they should only join the lit area themselves when the first person has arrived there. Because otherwise, they will be considered accomplices and will definitely be caught. From the moment the shadow of the one who challenged the group is no longer in contact with another. Or, when the first 3 minutes are up, the remaining participants have about 3 minutes to reach the area. The time it takes for the decision to go after them by default to be made. That's why the challenger must absolutely warn them as quickly as possible once he arrives. If he can't shout, he can simply send a short text message so that one of them can pass on the message. That doesn't matter. Once everyone has arrived, you'll need to wait about 15 minutes before starting again. The game can be restarted indefinitely until the first ray of sunlight. However, keep in mind that the more you play, the less time you'll have to get back to the lit area and the less you'll want to stray too far from it. A few additional remarks are necessary to ensure the game goes smoothly. First, the challenger must let the others know once he has arrived. It's really not funny to leave them in the dark without knowing whether you succeeded or not. Especially since you're making them waste precious time that they really need. Second point, in the same way, no one is allowed to try to prevent others from reaching the light source, or to make sure that a third party's number meets that of a participant. Once inside, imagine if you were pushed into the middle of a school of sharks just for fun. It's exactly the same. Number 3. The people are neither stupid nor deaf. There's no need to repeat the sentence several times on the spot or when you're running. That would only make him angry. And that's really not what you want. Number 4. In theory, we can replay the game indefinitely. But it is said that it's not meant to go beyond the number of midnight moves, and that those who try to play a 13th time on the same night would meet a rather unfortunate fate. Little 5. For those who have never challenged the people of the shadows during the night. If you really don't think you can reach the lighted area in the allotted time, you can put one knee on the ground and lower your head as a sign of submission. It is possible, and I do mean possible, that the people may choose to spare you. Nothing obliges them to do so. However, you must not get back up or re-enter the lit area for the rest of this round, including the 15-minute waiting period. You also must not challenge the shadow people in the next round, as they will be watching you. Little 6. For those who have challenged the shadow people at least once, it is also possible not to get caught. But there is no guarantee that the method will be successful. And the more the people have been challenged during the evening, the less likely they are to forgive. You must get down on your knees, with your hands and face to the ground, and apologize verbally. If you are still there, a few minutes after everyone has joined the lit area, you can go there in your turn, but you won't be able to leave it again until sunrise. Little 7. You might see strange shadows around you from the moment the first part begins. During your run, or while waiting, for example, try not to let yourself get distracted. It's simply the people moving around. Little 8. It's absolutely possible to stop playing along the way, even if others keep going. You just have to not leave the lit area at the same time as the remaining participants once the 15-minute waiting period is over. Generally speaking, when you stop playing, you have to wait until the end of the last phase. And then, everything is over. As long as you keep a small source of light, if needed, you can move around. Some players even choose to sleep with a nightlight on for the rest of the night, just in case. I hope that a lot of people will enjoy this game and that everyone will know how to respect the rules. And will you have the guts to challenge the people of the shadows? First of all, I'll tell you what I do for a living. That will help you understand my situation. I'm the boss of my own company, if you can call it that, but I'd rather describe my work as a personal service. I break into a house or building that my client has chosen, and I destroy or steal whatever they want. Usually my clients are often middle-class men, angry at their boss, or people who have recently broken up and want to get revenge on their ex. To sum up, I do the jobs that angry people want to do but don't have the courage to do themselves. I'm paid pretty well, and it gives me the opportunity to discover interesting places, so I'm quite satisfied with my job. A few weeks ago, I got a phone call, so I was expecting a usual routine job. The person asked me to break into an abandoned house not far from where I lived. He wanted me to retrieve some kind of recordings, video home system tapes, cassettes, DVDs, whatever the format. Because all he really wanted was for me to bring him recordings that, according to him, were very important. It didn't suit me, because in my job, the most important thing is the information I'm given. He didn't even want to tell me anything about himself. So I kindly explained to him that I didn't want to accept his offer. At least until he offered me an exorbitant amount to do the job. When the person mentioned an abandoned house, I expected it to be isolated from the city and that I would be able to sneak in during the day. But, unfortunately for me, the place was right in the middle of a completely normal street surrounded by other apartments and various buildings. What's more, they were all obviously inhabited. People in the neighborhood walked casually past the house, without even paying attention to its neglected appearance. So I came back at nightfall, and this time there were no pedestrians or any lights that could have given me away. Everything seemed to be going perfectly. The house had 2 floors and a small attic under the roof. The place didn't seem very pleasant to live in, and it probably hadn't been even before it became rundown. The best word that comes to mind to describe it is closed in. Apparently, in the house, there was only one window, and it was at the same level as the attic. The front door, which seemed to be the only entrance to the whole house, had a surprising number of padlocks attached to it. Padlocks that were now completely rusted. So rusted that a single kick was enough to break them. Even though I'm not particularly afraid of the dark, finding myself in a place I didn't know and where there was no light has never been my favorite thing. As soon as I entered the house, I was already eager to get it over with. I was in such a hurry that I didn't really pay attention to the house itself, nor to what it might have contained in detail. Once I got into the first room, I turned on my flashlight and quickly noticed that it was completely empty, as if it had been totally looted after the last residents had left. For me, it was both good news and bad news. The good news was that in this room, I was sure I wouldn't run into any obstacles, and the bad news was, since I was sure I wouldn't find anything in there, I would have to keep exploring the rest of the house, which was already giving me the chills. That wasn't the only reason I didn't want to linger too long. I was afraid a neighbor might hear me. But I reassured myself by thinking that, after all, this house had only one window, so it must be well insulated. I went upstairs and found a similar room. It was completely empty and didn't contain anything I was looking for. I didn't like that at all, because it meant I was going to have to inspect the attic. I know I said that I wasn't particularly afraid of the dark, but the fear of being locked in a tight space, that was another story. To get to the attic, you had to pull down a hatch that was in the ceiling of the room I was in. I had to pull several times, and pretty hard to open the hatch, but the stairs came down without too much effort. For a few seconds, a thick cloud of smoke blocked my view. That made me realize that, besides being old, the place had been closed up for even longer than I thought. With every step I took, the makeshift little staircase creaked loudly. It was almost unbearable. When I entered the attic, I saw the only window in the house. Through it, the moonbeams lit up the small room, which, by the way, really reassured me. As I looked around the room, I noticed a few boxes in one of the corners, 3 old cardboard boxes filled with old videotapes. There weren't any DVDs, but since the place looked so old, I wasn't really expecting to find any. Since I was eager to get it over with, I didn't even look properly inside. I just grabbed the heaviest box and dragged it to the stairs. I hadn't realized how many tapes were inside the box until I dropped it. It made a really heavy sound, which didn't match its size. I must have damaged a few tapes, but I didn't even take the time to stop and check. All I wanted was to get out of there. When I got to the bottom of the stairs, I didn't even bother to close the hatch. And that's when I noticed something strange. As I picked up the box, I saw a small red light in the corner of the room, like some kind of dot. It wasn't moving. But it startled me so much that I ran toward the stairs without even wanting to find out what it was. As I was about to go down the stairs, I realized that the house seemed to have a basement. There was no other way to realize it than by being exactly where I was. At the bottom of the stairs, there was another red dot, faint but still clearly visible. Since I had the cardboard box in my hands, I couldn't use my flashlight. And that's when I tripped. There's no more poetic way to describe it. I tripped and kind of rolled all the way down that damn staircase. Normally, I think I would have broken a leg or even my back. But the cardboard box got in my way, so I miraculously made it out, unscathed. All the tapes were scattered at the bottom of the stairs, but I didn't want to take the time to pick them all up. And I grabbed the 3 that were closest to me. My body hurt a lot, but I was mostly focused on all the noise I had made, which had probably alerted the whole neighborhood. I quickly left the house, got into the car, and drove home without running into any more problems. I woke up the next morning and I was sore all over. But the main thing is, I didn't get caught. I called my client several times, and as I was starting to suspect, he never answered. The number he gave me didn't even send me to voicemail. Knowing that the client made me do all that for nothing frustrated me a lot. Normally, when I broke into someone's place, I always stole a few extra things for myself, just in case the client decided not to pay me. But of course, in that house, I hadn't found anything else except those damn tapes. So I ended up with nothing to reward myself for the frightening adventure I'd just been through. Since all I had left were those tapes, I decided to watch them. Just in case, by some miracle, the client decided to call me back to ask what I had managed to get. After searching thoroughly at home, I managed to find a video home system player since the tapes didn't have any labels on them. I just inserted one of the 3 at random. The first tape I put in the player only showed static for the first few minutes. I was about to stop it. When an image appeared on the screen, there was a date on the lower left side of the screen, August 2nd, 2010. The date was abbreviated in the American way, so it said 08/02/10. On the recording, you could see a small, completely empty and deteriorated room. It looked like it was filmed in night vision. So, I assumed that the room must have been completely in the dark. The image was pretty static until a door not far from the camera opened. After that, you could see a young woman enter and the door closed behind her. Mikkel, it's me. Where are you?" She started pacing around, a look of fear and worry on her face. I thought that this Mikkel must be her son or another loved one she thought was in danger. She started moving her arms in the dark before taking out her phone to use it as a source of light. She then headed to the back of the room, turned left, and went toward what seemed to be some stairs. A few seconds later, the image disappeared and was replaced by interference. I had a pretty good idea where that scene had been filmed, but I refused to believe it. Because of that, I didn't want to watch another tape, but at the same time, I wanted to check if what I was thinking was correct. The next tape started the same way as the previous one, static for a few minutes, and then the beginning of the video. The footage showed another room that was just as dilapidated as the previous one. There was also a date in the corner of the screen that showed March 14th, 2013, so more than 2 years after the first video home system. Someone suddenly appeared in the room, and this time, it was an elderly man. He had a flashlight in his hand and started shining it at the ceiling. He then opened a hatch and pulled down the makeshift little stairs that led to an attic. And that's when I completely panicked. The red dots I had seen in the corner of the room were cameras. The abandoned house was full of them, and I'm sure there were even more cameras than the ones I had noticed. At first, I thought they were surveillance cameras installed by security guards, and I immediately looked out my windows to see if the police were outside my house. But luckily, there was no one there. I went back in front of the television and I saw the man go up the small staircase that led to the attic. He also seemed to be looking for something or someone. But, unlike the woman, he didn't say a word. He didn't seem to see the camera. Once the old man was completely inside the attic, the recording stopped. But I noticed something just before it cut off. The camera had moved as if someone had grabbed it. I quickly put the third and final tape into the player because I wanted to know what he had observed about me in that house. This tape showed the point of view of a camera that was facing the stairs. It looked like some kind of zoom, as if the camera was on one floor but was focusing on the floor above. At the top of the stairs, there was the same man who was there in the previous recording. The date was the same. I had picked up the tapes at random, but I was lucky enough to come across 2 recordings that followed each other. The man was injured. He was holding his left arm, which was bleeding. He stumbled with every step as he tried to make his way up the stairs to the first floor. And as he reached the very last step, he collapsed from exhaustion. As he fell, I could see that there was something behind him. It looked like a person about 6 feet tall. I say a person, but it didn't seem human. That thing moved up to the man and started dragging him by his injured arm. The man struggled a little, but the thing gave him a huge kick to the head to make him stop. It then led him toward another set of stairs, the ones that I think led to the basement. The thing was close enough to the camera that I could see its face, or rather, what was covering it. It was wearing some kind of mask, and I had the impression that the mask was made of old rags, in which holes had been cut for each eye, and it was torn in several other places. The bits of skin I could see through the slits looked black and covered with dried blood. So, the fact that his face was covered reassured me a little. The thing started staring at the camera for a moment, and its yellow eyes made me feel even more uneasy. Then it picked up the camera and turned it, which revealed a door at the bottom of the stairs. The being then lifted the man, opened the door, and threw him into a room that was also empty. Once the old man was inside, the door was quickly closed behind him, and the camera kept filming the door for several more minutes. What was disturbing were the sounds I heard. Behind the door, there were a lot of rapid scratching noises, as if someone was clawing at the walls. The injured man inside the room then started screaming, and other voices followed. The other screams sounded inhuman and more like animals than anything else. The old man's screams quickly stopped right after, which sounded like flesh and ligaments being torn apart. Quickly, I noticed that the entire recording was now silent. The door to the room then opened, and inside there were other creatures. They also seemed almost human, but they were frail and had grey skin. They were devoid of body hair and hair. Their spines were visible, as if they were trying to break out of their skin in a supernatural way. And some of the creatures were climbing on the walls and the ceiling. One of the creatures, which had its back to us, started to turn around, and the recording turned into static just before its face was revealed to me. Of course, I was terrified by what I had just seen. I had just come out of that place, and I had been filmed without my knowledge. I looked out my windows again and locked them all. I stayed locked up at home for several days without leaving the house, and I kept watch to see if I was being watched. I burned the tapes, and once I was sure I hadn't left any evidence that could lead them to me, I started going out again. I started accepting jobs again, but I categorically refused to go to abandoned places. But about 2 weeks ago, I received a package that was left in front of my front door. I thought it was probably payment from a recent client, since most of them left me cash. But when I opened the package, I found 3 videotapes that looked new. All 3 were numbered from 1 to 3. So I put tape number 1 into the player. It was a recording of the same house as before, from the camera that was in the first empty room. A few minutes went by, then someone came in. It was a fairly young man, wearing black clothes, as if he was trying to blend in. It didn't even take me a second to realize that it was me, and that the videos were going to show my path through the house. I immediately put in tape number 2, and on it, there was a recording from the camera that was placed near the basement door. I could see myself falling down the stairs, the cardboard box in my hands. And then I noticed that I hadn't tripped, but that I had actually been pushed. The thing wearing the mask was at the top of the stairs, right behind me. She had pushed me just lightly enough that I didn't even feel it. You can then see me getting up really quickly, grabbing the 3 tapes, and disappearing from the screen. Which is exactly the moment when I ran away from the house. Then, the masked creature rushed down the stairs and watched me escape. Then it moved up to the camera and stared at it. Before the recording cut off, I was completely petrified, and my adrenaline level was at its peak. I had to muster up all my courage to play the last and 3rd tape. The recording on this one didn't show the inside of the abandoned house. The camera was being held by someone, and it was filming the outside of another place. The person holding the camera was walking on a sidewalk and started to zoom in on a house. And as you probably guessed, that house was mine. No matter who or what was filming, that thing let out a demonic scream. Right before the recording ended. Since then, I've become paranoid. I don't dare go out anymore, and I stay locked up at home all the time. Every time I have to go outside, I feel like I see the masked creature out of the corner of my eye. I don't know if it's my imagination or if that thing is really there. Sometimes I hear knocking at my door, and when I open it, I find a new tape placed right in front of it. They're always recordings of my house, filming day and night. But what really worries me is that each time the masked figure seems to be filming closer and closer to my house. I can't tell you my name, nor can I tell you exactly what my job is. Because unfortunately, if I do that, they'll know who I am, and I might lose my job. My only goal is to tell you about the strange events that took place. Because these deserve to be heard, and not locked away in old cabinets gathering dust. What I can tell you about my work is that, thanks to it, I have access to some truly unique written testimonies. These testimonies are written by police officers in the field during interventions who have experienced strange things during their operations. There are all kinds of cases in these files, but the section that truly sent chills down my spine is the paranormal section. People need to know, and that's why I'm going to share some notes from this file with you. Each of the cases I'm going to tell you about comes from different police officers who don't know each other and work in different police stations. Without further delay, here they are. First entry, Josh Morgan, Huntsville Police Department, Alabama. The incident involved a call from a little girl who had asked the police for help because her father was beating her mother. I was called immediately, and together with my colleague, we hurried to the location given. Once we arrived, we quickly went to the front door and knocked. After a few knocks, a man opened the door for us. It was Mr. Scott, dressed in a tank top and shorts. He still seemed half asleep and surprised by our presence. We asked him a few questions and talked about the fact that his daughter had called for help and that we needed to question her as well. Mr. Scott then widened his eyes, but before he could say anything, we heard screams coming from what seemed to be the upper floor of the mansion. The words were clear, and the female voice was saying, "Stop him, please, he has a knife." I reacted quickly. She was pinned to the ground. The clatter of a blade falling on the tiles was heard, and Mr. Scott tried to struggle after that. The weapon was a kitchen knife that he had slipped into his belt. Who knows what would have happened to Mrs. Scott if we had arrived late? But even worse, what would have happened to her if her daughter hadn't called us? Precisely, here is the strange fact. As part of Mr. Scott's conviction, we questioned the entire family who were in the family home. That's how we realized something truly strange. Mr. Scott's violence stems from a particular fact, even though, in my eyes, nothing excuses such barbarity. This sudden violence seems to follow a family tragedy that Mr. Scott had trouble overcoming, from which he couldn't heal. This concerns the death of his daughter, which occurred a year before our intervention. What is most alarming about all this is that indeed there were only 2 people left living in that manor. Where did the call come from? Was it really from Scott's daughter, who had died a year earlier? That's a question that will never have an answer, if you ask me. Second entry, Ethan Wolf, Little Rock Police Department, Arkansas. If I had known, I would have left things as they were and never gotten involved. I know I'm not supposed to act alone, but it was like a reflex, and I couldn't let something like that happen. The case I got involved in almost gave me a bad reputation, and that's why I want to report it. It all started on May 21st, 2015, while I was patrolling the Wingate neighborhood. It was around midnight when my colleague got out of the car to relieve himself for a moment, while I stayed on the passenger side waiting for him. It was pretty warm, so I rolled down the window. That's how I heard the screams, terrifying screams that sounded like someone was calling for help. I acted quickly and shouted to my colleague to come back, but I had no idea where he had gone. Again, the cries of pain echoed, and I was immediately able to locate the place. It was some kind of alley on the other side of the street. I called for backup and ran toward the noise, weapon in hand. I quickly arrived in front of the alley, but then the scream stopped. I moved forward cautiously, aiming straight ahead, my weapon in my right hand, my flashlight in my left. The further I went, the more I wondered if I had just imagined it. But I had to be sure, because a life might be in danger. The further I went down the alley, the more the darkness surrounded me. My flashlight seemed to shine less and less brightly, as if its batteries were running out. As I moved forward, I felt cold drafts, and a sense of imminent danger began to overwhelm me. The light was about to go out, and I was about to find myself in total darkness, at the mercy of a potentially violent person. So it was with regret that I turned back. I had the idea of waiting for backup before intervening. I couldn't do anything in the dark except possibly shoot an innocent person, and I couldn't take that risk. I jogged toward the entrance of the alley, and after a few seconds, I was blinded by an especially bright light. It took a little while before my eyes adjusted, and I was able to see where it was coming from. It was the beam of a flashlight aimed directly at me. That's when my colleague spoke. He said, "What are you doing?" I was relieved because I was no longer alone, and we would be able to track the screams together. I started to walk towards him and asked him to lower his flashlight because I couldn't see anything except his silhouette. I asked him once, twice, but he kept shining his flashlight at me. After a while, I started to ask him more firmly to lower his damn flashlight. He complied, and very slowly at that. The beam of light started to illuminate the concrete in front of him, then the tips of his feet. I stopped in my tracks with a start and tried to point my flashlight in his direction, but it wasn't shining at all at that moment. I pointed my weapon straight at him, but I couldn't say a single word. Because what I saw completely paralyzed me, and I was absolutely not prepared for it. Those weren't my colleague's feet, and even worse, his feet weren't even touching the ground. What was in front of me was literally floating above the concrete. I felt my hands trembling as I kept aiming at him, and in a final effort, I finally managed to say a sentence. I shouted at the figure to lie flat on the ground. But instead, he started gradually revealing the rest of his body to me with his flashlight. I saw his knees, then his stomach, and then his torso. He stopped just before revealing his face to me and said in a sort of rasp, still with my friend's voice, "You don't want to see what I look like." But, to my great misfortune, I caught a glimpse of what he didn't want to show me. Because at the base of his neck, I could see the tip of his forked tongue, from which long strands of drool were dripping. I fired 2 or 3 times because I was certain that the thing in front of me was not human. But instead of hearing cries of pain, I heard his laughter. His laughter was not human at all and kept echoing in my head. I felt that if he kept laughing like that, my head would explode and my brains would be scattered everywhere, on the ground of that alley. I fired again, but nothing. The creature was still laughing non-stop. I was starting to lose hope when something saved me from this horror. Another light, the one from my colleague's flashlight. He was shining it at the entrance of the alley and was only a few steps away from the creature. I saw the monster's upper body turn toward my colleague, and its eyes froze in the distance. My colleague had probably just seen its face, since his eyes widened and seemed emptied of all emotion. I ran toward the road, skirting around the creature, and felt the cold draft brushing against the back of my neck. A sign that it was just about to grab my throat. When I passed by him, I got next to my colleague and turned around. But there was nothing there anymore. I looked all around me, but it was useless. The creature had vanished. Afterwards, I went back to the car, pulling my colleague by the arm, who still couldn't move and seemed paralyzed with fear. I went to the police station and felt nauseous. I never thought I would experience such horror during my career. The most frustrating thing about all this is that I don't know what it is. But one thing is certain, I wasn't taken very seriously, even though similar sightings had been reported in the city of Little Rock. But they still took my statement. But, as you might expect, nothing came of the case. My colleague, on the other hand, wasn't as lucky as I was. He's still in the hospital and hasn't said a single word since the incident. He was the only one who saw his face. And day and night, I thank heaven that I didn't see him too. Third entry, David Stevenson, Alexandria Police Department, Minnesota. All of this happened on August 9th, 2004. I was alone in my car on my way to drop off my vehicle at the impound lot when I heard a call for help on my radio. At that moment, it was 1:30 in the morning. The call had been made by a man. He was screaming that he needed help and backup in front of Woodland Elementary School. I answered the call without thinking for a single second about what I was about to face in the minutes that would follow. Near the cemetery, not far from the school, I finally saw the flashing lights of the unit that was calling for help. The car was parked with the door open, right in front of Woodland School. I ran toward the car and drew my service weapon. After a few moments, I saw a man crouched in the back of the car, aiming his gun straight ahead. It was Officer Thompson, and he seemed to be in a total state of panic. I ran to take cover with him and asked him what was going on. He was speaking quickly and wasn't very clear. He told me that something had taken his partner into the school. Something indescribable and disproportionately large. We waited for reinforcements, and after a few minutes, we were a whole squad in front of the school. Without waiting any longer, we intervened and crossed the long path leading to the Woodland reception. The place was particularly cold, much too cold for the month of August. I asked Officer Thompson for more details to know exactly what we were tracking. He then told me it was a man about 2 meters tall wearing a black 3-piece suit. We searched absolutely everywhere, upstairs, in the different classrooms, even down to the school basement, but there was no trace of passage. Around 2 o'clock, we decided to turn back and search around the school, outside. Officer Thompson and I stayed back, keeping watch around us. And just as Officer Thompson stepped through the front door, it slammed shut on me. I shouted, asking them to open the door for me, thinking they had slammed it in my face. But I could hear them pushing hard against the door, but it wouldn't budge. I still don't know what closed that door, whether it was the wind or something else. But even when I pulled with all my strength, it wouldn't move at all, iota. So I decided to go through one of the windows, which meant I had to go through one of the classrooms on my right, because unfortunately for me, the reception area didn't have any windows. I went through the classroom door and headed toward the large window that led to the schoolyard. I was about to break the glass when I heard a strange noise to my left, where the many tables and chairs were lined up, as if someone was scribbling something with a pencil on a sheet of paper or in a notebook. I turned toward the noise and saw the officer's partner, Thompson. He was sitting on a chair and holding an open notebook in front of him, on which he was scribbling strange shapes and symbols that looked like they came straight out of a science fiction movie. I put my hand on his shoulder and asked him what he was doing. He looked at me with a gaze that seemed lifeless, devoid of any life. He put his finger to his mouth and asked me to be quieter. He then whispered to me that he couldn't hear what the teacher was saying to him. My eyes were still scanning his notebook when I heard a noise on the chalkboard in front of me. Slowly, I raised my head and placed my hand on my weapon, which I had previously put back in its holster. Someone was standing with their back to the board. He was at least 2 meters tall, and his head was almost touching the ceiling. He was drawing the same strange symbols that were in the notebook, but they were oddly misshapen because his hand was shaking in an inhuman way. In fact, his whole body was trembling like that. I made a monumental mistake at that very moment, because instead of running away through the window with my colleague, I spoke out loud. In a barely audible whisper, I said, "My God, what is that?" Immediately after that, he stopped writing on the board and froze. His body was no longer trembling, but his hand was still holding the chalk, pressed against the big slate. I drew my weapon and shouted toward the window. I felt that something horrible was about to happen. Only my colleagues weren't fast enough, or rather, he was much faster than they were. The tall man turned around and showed me his gaunt face. He no longer had pupils, a nose, or lips. He looked like a severe burn victim straight out of Empin County. Everything that happened next went by very quickly. The man crouched down and went under the big table. Then he crawled as fast as he could under each of the small tables, knocking several of them over as he went. I saw my colleague look up at me, still just as empty, and he only had time to say a single sentence. That sentence was, "He needs me, let him take me." And then I saw 2 huge hands gripping his calves under the table, 2 white hands without any hair or nails. That's when I was finally able to open fire for the first time. But the bullet went through his forearm without spilling a single drop of blood. He shot at my colleague's legs, who fell off his chair and disappeared quickly under the table. I immediately ducked down, pointing my weapon straight ahead. But I discovered with horror that I was alone in this classroom. Neither my colleague nor the tall, disfigured man were there. They had completely disappeared. I didn't have time to look around the room before I heard the sound of glass shattering behind me. My colleagues were there and immediately asked me what was happening, why I had called for help. To be completely honest, I didn't dare say anything. I lied to them and explained that I thought I saw someone at the back of the room. I was afraid of losing my job because as I kept scanning the room, I couldn't see any evidence to prove what I was saying. Except for one thing, the notebook that was on the floor next to the table, the geometric signs were still there. But that wasn't enough evidence to support the events I had just experienced. I already had to justify the gunshot I had fired, and I didn't want to end up in a psychiatric hospital like Officer Thompson probably would. So it's on the verge of retirement, 17 years later, that I decide to recount these events. Of course, I looked into all of this, but unfortunately, I didn't find anything about the tall man. And to this day, Officer Thompson's partner has never been found. I still have the notebook with me, and the only truly strange and disturbing thing I can get from it is the many help me messages that were written between each of the geometric figures. I've always dreamed of driving on Route 66 in America. That famous road, known for being so long that it's almost impossible to travel it by vehicle without stopping. Even though today it has been officially decommissioned, it was no less than 2,448 miles long, which is the equivalent of 3,945 kilometers. Many people dream of driving on it, but few people dare to go. Indeed, the trip is expensive and requires a lot of preparation. A vehicle on site, a lot of gas, money to plan for meals, or to sleep in a hotel. A plane ticket if you live outside the territory. But above all, quite a bit of courage. It was on my 25th birthday that I decided to take the plunge. I was talking with my brother about many things I hadn't accomplished yet, about my childhood dreams, as well as my biggest projects. And I quickly realized that I had never considered traveling to America until then, and even less to travel Route 66. So I started looking into the cost of the trip and any possible preparations. Not surprisingly, the price was high, but contrary to what I thought, it was within my means. I had saved quite a bit over the past few years, and those savings were finally going to be useful for something, to fulfill one of my childhood dreams. In the days that followed, I organized everything. I rented a Harley-Davidson style motorcycle, and I checked the different places to fill up with gas. Then, finally, I booked my plane ticket to Chicago, the start of my long journey. I planned not to do the entire route, but only half of it. So my main destination was the very center of Route 66, namely the small town of Adrian, Texas, a town with barely 150 inhabitants. In terms of costs, it was easily doable. That was about 1,800 kilometers, and for me, that was more than enough to enjoy the trip. I decided not to book a hotel in advance, but to carry cash with me and just wing it. Basically, I would sleep in the hotels or motels I found along the way. It was both dangerous and exciting. An American-style road trip, right? I was sure that this road trip would stay in my memory forever, that I could never regret taking the plunge. I was right about the first part, but definitely not about the second. When the big day arrived, I grabbed my small suitcase and set off toward the airport. The flight was pretty long, but I was so excited that I didn't sleep the whole time. The only times I was awake were to eat or go to the bathroom, or sometimes to look out the window. Luckily for me, I arrived pretty late and went straight to sleep in the only hotel I had booked, in Chicago, not far from the starting point of my road trip. I slept like a rock until 6 in the morning, and I immediately started the first phase of my big journey. Namely, picking up the motorcycle. I took my backpack out of my suitcase and gathered a few spare clothes, and I took a taxi to the dealership that was renting out these little marvels. After waiting at the reception for a moment, I finally met the salesman. I filled out the various papers to finalize the rental, and I didn't wait any longer to start my long journey. The bike was absolutely perfect, with its handling, its speed, and the sound it made. Everything was exactly as I had imagined. I was living my childhood dream. I remember smiling, thinking back on the courage I had shown. A lot of people never take the leap and decide to only travel close to home. I'm not that kind of person, and I prefer to live my dreams rather than just dream about my life. I drove toward my first stop, which was the city of Clinton in Oklahoma. On this long road that stretched for several kilometers, I expected to come across several restaurants or small towns, but that wasn't the case. I had brought several power banks and my phone battery was full, but I wanted to use the global positioning system. In case of last resort, a road trip loses all its charm when you're being guided by something. I wanted to follow the signs and stick to just that. My gas tank was full, and I even had another can ready just in case. But I started to worry when I saw the sun setting in the distance. The road was starting to get long and darker. So I pulled over to the side of the road and took out my phone. I was absolutely certain that I had made a mistake somewhere, that I had taken the wrong road. So I opened the Global Positioning System app on my cell phone, and that's when the problem started. I had no signal, but even worse, the Global Positioning System wouldn't locate me. In fact, it was locating me in the wrong place. According to it, I hadn't even left Chicago yet, even though I'd already been on the road for several hours. I looked around to possibly ask for help, but there was no one on the road except me. Moreover, night was beginning to fall, and the darkness was becoming more and more present. I took a deep breath and decided to refocus before giving in to panic. I listed all the possibilities available to me so I could resume my journey properly. And the only viable option was to turn back and then resume the journey on a better footing. But I knew that by doing that, I wouldn't see a restaurant for at least 6 hours of driving. I was starting to get really hungry, but more importantly, I knew that fatigue would catch up with me halfway through. I questioned myself like that for several minutes until something caught my attention. In the distance, there were lights far away. I hadn't noticed them before because it wasn't dark enough, but now they were clearly visible, piercing through the darkness. All the way at the end of the long road, I sat down on the motorcycle and started the engine. Then I rode toward those points of light, without thinking. They were probably streetlights, and so most likely a city. I drove for a few minutes and had to take a dirt road to reach those lights. The motorcycle wasn't suited for this kind of terrain, but fortunately it didn't last long. I rode like that for a little while, until I finally saw the city sign. On it, it said, "Welcome to Milton Town, the city that always comes in handy." At that moment, I totally agreed with what the sign said. But that didn't last very long. The town was very strange. Right from the start, the streetlights were dim, which made the houses especially dark and uninviting. I was driving slowly to avoid waking people up while looking for a place to sleep that night, but it didn't really help much. A face started to appear at one of the windows on my right, then a second one on my left, and it kept going, for a while. I didn't feel welcome here, and my presence seemed to intrigue the residents of Milton Town. I decided to keep my eyes on the road when I saw an eighth face peeking out from behind those curtains at my feet. It hadn't even been 10 minutes since I set foot in this town, and I already felt terribly uncomfortable. Minutes passed, and I held back a cry of joy when I saw the motel sign 200 meters ahead on the side of the road. To avoid making any more noise, I turned off the engine and decided to push the motorcycle the rest of the way. After a few steps, it was finally there. The motel sign was flashing blue, then purple, then yellow, making a neon buzzing sound each time the color changed. It was perfectly cliché, like a real American crime novel. I parked my motorcycle in front of the entrance, set the anti-theft device, and walked through the reception door. The first thing that struck me was the smell. A strong musty odor immediately hit my nose. It was a mix of dust and wood rotted by time. The decor was typical of old American motels. The floor was covered with brown, faded carpet, and a tasteless wallpaper was awkwardly put up on the walls. But to be completely honest, I didn't care at all. I needed to sleep, but more than anything, I couldn't wait for morning to get out of here and continue my journey. I pressed the little bell at the reception and waited for the receptionist. After waiting for 5 minutes, I tried again, but nothing. The receptionist was still nowhere to be found, and I was seriously starting to get impatient. Just as I was about to press it a third time, I saw him. My heart skipped a beat. Not because of his sudden presence, but mainly because he had always been there. He was 2 meters from the counter, in the shadows, and I hadn't even noticed him. How long had he been there staring at me in the dock? I had no idea at all. I greeted him and asked him about the prices, but he didn't answer me. And he just smiled at me and stared at me. I swallowed and asked him the question again. He raised his hand and pointed at the sign hanging on the wall. On it were displayed the rates, one night $30. I reached into my pocket and gave him the money. After looking at the bills for a moment without touching them, he turned around, slowly took the keys from the rack, and handed them to me. I thanked him and didn't even bother to ask where my room was, because his presence was starting to seriously frighten me. I finally found my room, number 18, after a few moments searching on the first floor. The interior was poorly decorated and very old-fashioned. I had the impression that the same wallpaper from the reception was in my room. The carpet, on the other hand, was a bit lighter, but just as faded as the one on the ground floor. The bed, for its part, seemed clean, even though its decoration left something to be desired. I opened the window to get rid of the musty smell. Then I looked outside for a moment. The fog had settled over the entire city during the brief moment I had spent at the reception. I was not only shocked by how quickly it had settled in, but also by the fact that it wasn't cold at all. I kept watching for a moment and almost fell backward when I saw the little one on my left waving at me in the street. He couldn't have been taller than about 5 feet, was wearing some kind of black cap, and was moving his hand from right to left toward me. I was about to go back inside and close the window when I noticed the other figures on my right. 2 adults in the shadows, who also seemed to be signaling to me. Like the child, they were moving slowly, their hand from right to left. I trembled with fear. The situation was so uncomfortable. When I glanced to my left again, my heart almost stopped. Not only had the little one moved closer to the window, but now 2 other children were standing behind him. And, like the first child, they were gently swinging their hands from right to left. I immediately pulled my head back into my room and closed the window. I turned off the lights and lay down on the bed without bothering to undress. Milton Town was clearly a town full of lunatics, sociopaths, or who knows what else. and I clearly didn't want to linger in this town. All I wanted was to close my eyes for a moment, ask for directions so I could continue my journey the next morning and get far, far away from here. And that's exactly what I did. I slept barely 3 or 4 hours. I went down the stairs to the lobby, and there I noticed that the weird receptionist was still there. I almost asked him if he ever slept, or if he slept standing up or hanging from the ceiling like a bat. But I held back. I guess he wouldn't have appreciated the joke. When I asked him for directions, he just did the same thing as the day before. Smile, look me straight in the eyes, but most importantly, not answer. I was feeling more and more uncomfortable, but I had the courage to ask a second time. But as expected, he didn't answer again. The discomfort got the better of me, and I decided to leave. After all, turning back was my first suggestion, but my stomach loudly reminded me that I had forgotten another detail. I was starving. I needed to eat before getting back on the road. Do you know what's the most important thing when you're on a road trip? The first thing, and I mean the very first, is to think about food. I had water, but absolutely nothing to eat. And I can assure you that I never cursed myself more than at that moment for not having thought of something as essential as food. So, to sum up quickly, by turning back, there was no restaurant for at least 6 hours, no food in my pack, and so I was forced to feed myself on the spot. Milton Town was far from done with me. I walked around town on foot, thinking I might find a little restaurant. Or even just a simple store to buy some takeout sandwiches, or anything else that could fill me up a little. And that's when I came across this particularly strange restaurant. Its name was Guest to Eat, but the storefront looked like an old antique shop. I had never seen a restaurant sell itself so poorly. Right from the start, I couldn't even see inside because the windows were so dirty. I took out my cell phone, hoping there would be signal again so I could either get back on my way or find another, more presentable restaurant. But nothing, there was still no signal, and I still had no idea where I was exactly. I hesitated for a long moment, and it was only after my stomach growled a second time that I finally decided to go in. The inside matched the exterior perfectly. The musty smell from the motel was also present here, and the view was especially ugly. It looked like an old abandoned diner. The chairs weren't even placed properly. The tables, which hadn't been used in a long time, looked dirty and aged by the years. And the floor, tiled and grimy, seemed to be stained with sauce in some places. As for the customers, there were 2 or 3 people there eating a hamburger, and they all had their backs turned to me. I didn't dare say a word. Anyway, it seemed to be a custom here. I walked up to the counter and saw the different burgers offered above my head on a long board. To tell you the truth, there were only 3. And only burgers, of course. No hot dogs, fries, or salads. No, it was only burgers. But given how hungry I was, I had no intention of being picky. An employee who seemed to work in the kitchen then came up to me. He smiled at me, but he didn't greet me. He just stood there, staring at me without moving. I then broke the silence and asked him for one of the hamburgers that was on the menu. Without saying a word, he went back to the kitchen and got back to work. At that moment, I remember thinking that I hadn't heard another person besides myself speak for more than 14 hours. 14 hours without hearing a single other voice but my own. Who can brag about having experienced something like that these days? The cook came back after a while and handed me the oil-stained cardboard box that was supposed to contain my hamburger. I handed him $5 and went to sit down. At the table that looked the least dirty of all, the hamburger was particularly disgusting. To tell you the truth, it was inedible. But hunger sometimes pushes you to your limits. And I didn't leave a single crumb. I had never eaten such a strange steak before. The texture and taste didn't match that of beef. The salad could just as well have been plastic, and I wouldn't have noticed the difference. The rest of the ingredients had no flavor, as the strange taste of the steak overpowered everything. I got up from my chair and turned around, ready to leave. Which I couldn't do at that moment, because what was in front of me simply paralyzed me with fear. The 3 people who were previously sitting and eating were now standing, smiling at me and staring at me. I was about to ask them what they wanted, but all 3 of them raised their right hand to greet me, while slowly waving it from right to left. I didn't wait another minute, and quickly left the restaurant. This damn city was freaking me out, and I didn't want to stay there another second. So, without waiting, I got on the motorcycle and started it up. I had slept, I had eaten, so I had nothing left to do here. As for asking for directions, I'd rather go through a 6-hour trip and ask normal people for that. As I was driving, there was no one in the streets. So I kept going until I finally passed the city sign. I glanced back and almost fell off my bike. When I saw what was in the city streets, there were at least 30 people on the sidewalks, on the road, and at their windows. And all those people were watching me leave, and then once again they waved at me. At that moment, I was really happy that I had made the decision to leave that place. Who knows what would have happened to me if I had stayed in that madhouse. I kept driving, and as agreed, I turned around to head back to the nearest town. Since that day, I have never set foot in Milton town again. The rest of my trip went smoothly. After that, I eventually made it to halfway down Route 66. I met quite a few people and really enjoyed my trip. But even though I was satisfied, this place, Milton town, stayed on my mind. In my opinion, it was something in my trip that stood out like a blot on an otherwise beautiful picture. That's why, once I returned to my country, I started researching Milton town. I was satisfied when I saw that the town really did exist. It was located not far from Route 66, but even today I wonder how I could have been so wrong. Because the road to get to that place had nothing to do with the one I was supposed to take to get to Clinton. I didn't dwell on it too much because it's true that my sense of direction can sometimes mess up a bit. That's a detail I should have taken into account before leaving. So I read the content of the article, thinking I was going to find out what was wrong with the people living in that town. The good news is that I got answers to most of my questions. The bad news is that I won't be able to explain to you how all of this is possible. As I told you, the city of Milton really exists. And yes, its inhabitants are strange. But in a way, they really seemed welcoming since they spent their time greeting me. I guess it's not often that you come across a soul in this town, someone who's alive, I mean. Because Milton is not a town like the others. It's a ghost town, dead for more than 50 years. No one lives there anymore, and no business is supposed to be open there. What I experienced in Milton, I will never be able to explain. But one thing is certain. The things that were in that place clearly knew that I was still alive, that I had a soul. If I had let my guard down, God only knows what those things would have done to me. There are many museums in the world. Some museums display old fossils, others beautiful paintings, or even beautiful ancient statues restored for the public's enjoyment. In the one where I worked, it was a mix of all that. But it had a feature that no other museum had. Its rules. Yes, I know, all museums have rules, but I assure you that the rules I'm going to tell you about have absolutely nothing to do with those of other museums. I worked in that museum for 2 long years, and if I stayed that long, it was for one reason only, the salary. There is no other reason than that really. I needed a job quickly because I couldn't afford to pay for all my studies. When I arrived in the city, it was the perfect job for me. Moreover, most museums pay their night watchmen very poorly, but this one was clearly an exception to the rule. So I didn't hesitate and I jumped at the opportunity. When I arrived, they trained me on the spot right away. The night watchman, who was retiring, made sure to properly explain the basics to me. And within a week I was already ready to take over his position and do my rounds completely on my own. Because yes, after all, it's true that the job of a night watchman isn't as complicated as it seems. I simply had to clock in with a small card at very specific times, at the 4 corners of the museum, passing through all the exhibition rooms. The hours have always been the same, from 8 in the evening to 7 in the morning. Then, it was up to the day team to take over. I only worked 3 days a week, and then it was up to the other night watchmen to do the rest of the nights. On the first day of work, I arrived about 40 minutes early. I remember being surprised to see my boss, Madame Godefroy, patiently waiting for me at my post. I thought then that she wanted to spend part of the night with me. She wanted to see if she could really trust me with the keys to the house, but I was wrong. She was holding a rather thin brown envelope in her hands and she placed it on my desk. After asking me if I was ready for the night, she smiled, looked at me for a moment, then left. It was only after a few minutes that I noticed what was written on the envelope. To be read absolutely before the start of your shift. My shift, which was supposed to start in about 20 minutes, so I hurried to open the envelope. I thought then that it was just some paperwork or a sheet summarizing everything the previous night watchman had taught me. But I was way off. I hadn't paid attention to it at first, but it's true that the boss's look was strange. You know, that sideways look full of compassion. Not the look that wishes you good night, no, but more like the look that means good luck. I felt that what was in the envelope was going to be something very important. So, without further delay, I took out the single sheet that was hidden inside. The header was almost empty. In fact, there was only one sentence written: "Thank you for following these rules to the letter. Otherwise, you risk being sanctioned, fired, or worse." I remember smiling because I couldn't imagine anything worse than being fired. But that smile didn't last long, because right below that sentence were a lot of strange rules. Since I still have that little card with me, I'll list them for you one by one. Rule number 1. There's no reason to worry if you come across Homo, top hat, in the Italian paintings section. He'll stand still and stare at his favorite painting, just like he does every time. However, it is strictly forbidden to try to touch his hat. When you see him during your rush hour, please do not clock in, and leave the information on a post-it that you will place directly on Madame Godefroy's desk. Rule number 2. Frequently check that the storage room door is properly locked. It must never be open. If you hear noises such as scratching or a baby crying, be extra vigilant and check every hour. Rule number 3. Sometimes, the chandelier on the ceiling, right above the reception, makes a strange noise. If that happens, whatever you do, don't look up. She likes to hang there, but she hates being watched. Rule number 4. As you know, the fish in the break room must be fed during the day. So there's no reason for you to go there, unless it's to clean the aquarium. Just please make sure to count them correctly. There are always 2 goldfish and 3 blue neon tetras. If you find another fish, often reported as some kind of black eyeless guppy, please never put your hand in the aquarium. Rule number 5. When you take the elevator to reach the exhibition rooms on the 2nd floor, please turn your back to the mirror. What is in the reflection stays there, as long as you don't pay attention to it. But if, unfortunately, your eyes have landed on it, please contact Madame Godefroy as soon as possible if you still can. Rule number 6. No one ever calls on the display phone in the antiquities room. This one is definitely unplugged and must never be picked up under any circumstances. What's on the other end of the line isn't supposed to be able to call, and it must never make contact with you. Rule number 7. It's up to you, the watchers, to collect and enter the museum visitors' complaints into Excel. However, sometimes a certain pagoda leaves a strange comment asking the reception to set her free because she is suffering terribly. Pagoda is the name of the statue located behind the reception desk. So, I kindly ask you to please ignore those comments. Rule number 8. The restroom code is 7485 and will always be 7485. So, if by any chance you enter the wrong code and the door still opens, never go inside. Anyway, what you'll see behind the door will completely discourage you. Rule number 9. The contemporary art exhibition room can sometimes do strange things. Sometimes, some paintings change places, or one of them falls to the floor. If this happens in other rooms, you must act immediately. The contemporary art room is the only exception. So, I would appreciate it if you could leave the paintings on the floor and not worry about the mess in the room. It seems that it's the portrait in one of the paintings that's causing it. But to this day, it's impossible for us to get rid of it because it always ends up coming back. Rule number 10. At exactly midnight, the power might go out and nothing will work in the museum anymore. If that happens, please remain seated as calmly as possible while waiting for the power to come back on by itself. It is strictly forbidden to go to the basement and try to reactivate it yourself, except, of course, if this happens at times other than midnight. After a while, he will eventually get bored and turn the power back on after about 20 minutes. Rule number 11. You might hear 2 women talking in German in the World War II exhibition room. You can do your rounds and check in without any problem, but when they stop talking, don't look at them and leave as quickly as possible all the way to the reception. Rule number 12. Alexandra Victoria's wedding dress sometimes moves all the way to the antiquities room. It is far from harmless and must be kept under surveillance through the security cameras. Never enter the antiquities room if it is there. Rule number 13. When passing through the statue room, please keep your flashlight pointed at the statue that has no arms. If you happen to lose sight of it and it has therefore moved towards you, there's no need to put it back in its place. Just make sure to keep an eye on it until you leave the room. It will return to its original place by itself once you have left the room. Rule number 14. If you feel nauseous when going to clock in at the medieval exhibition hall, please return quickly to your station and look at yourself in the reception mirror. If you notice that your eyelids are trembling or that your nose and/or forehead are becoming deformed, lie down for about 30 minutes. Some night guards did not follow these instructions, and as a result, one of them had to be hospitalized urgently at 4 in the morning because he had mistaken his apple for a light bulb that was on the reception desk. So please stay alert about that. Thank you. Rule number 15. It's normal that, on your surveillance monitors, you don't see the room where the great white shark is. We disabled the camera there, following numerous complaints from the previous guards before you. They claim that sometimes they saw unbearable murder scenes there, always involving members of their family. Nevertheless, you can clock in that room without any risk. Rule number 16. There is no employee named Zora in the establishment. If you happen to come across a cleaning lady around 2 or 3 in the morning named Zora, please contact us immediately. The number on the back of this card will tell you that the number is not assigned. But nevertheless, this action will make her disappear. However, be careful. She might scream and her face might become horribly distorted just before she leaves. This is where the rules end. 16 rules that I have always scrupulously followed because everything was true. But despite everything, I had some truly traumatic experiences during those 2 years of work. And even though I still had to save for another 6 months, I was somehow pushed out. Because I had the misfortune of not following rule number 6 one evening, and so I picked up the display phone. What I heard on the other end of the line was my own voice whispering to me that I had to leave this museum as soon as possible. I didn't know if the entity was actually warning me of a danger or if it was playing some kind of joke on me. But honestly, I didn't feel like thinking at that moment, and this place was really starting to keep me from sleeping. So, I turned in my badge the next morning and got as far away from that museum as possible. And now, here I am, telling you about the events of that strange museum. I didn't have any particular goal in telling you all this, but I sincerely hope you'll think twice. Before accepting a new job, don't hesitate to ask your company's management if there are any special internal rules before you take the job, because you never know. And to conclude, I would say that this experience mainly raised a question that I still don't have an answer to today. Was I supposed to watch over this museum to keep intruders from coming in, or rather, to make sure those things didn't get out? Have you ever felt that way? Like when you go get a glass of water at night, for example, or when you're alone in a particularly dark room. Sometimes it's just a simple draft. Other times you can feel its heavy gaze on you. Everyone has experienced that before. And what the vast majority of people do is simply ignore the signs. Even if you felt the draft when all the windows are closed, and you felt that gaze even though you were completely alone in the house. Some people can see it, children who like to call it the monster under the bed, or even the boogeyman. But there are also the more sensitive people who very quickly end up in a psychiatric hospital. It never shows itself, but still, it's always there. Watching you, whether you're on public transport, at the office, or even at home on your couch, listening to stories or watching television series. If during your childhood it moved around freely and only when it was very dark, that's not the case during adolescence or adulthood. No, it prefers to stay in a very specific place, a place where it's sure it will never be seen. Behind your back, it stays there, constantly hidden behind you. So it's completely normal to sometimes feel its breath on your neck or to hear some strange little noises. It's discreet, but you know what they say, nobody's perfect. His luck is that he's completely invisible to others. Every human has their own, and because of that, he has no reason to show himself to others. He already has a lot to do with you. Constantly watching you isn't his only and unique task, right? He also enjoys pulling on your sheets when you sleep. You touch the cheek of his frozen hand when you turn over in your bed. And he can also knock something off your nightstand if he gets a little bored. He's a little scary, that's true. Let's just say his jaw is held on by a tiny strip of flesh, and 2 gaping holes serve as his nose. And his eyes, a very peculiar shade of white, would chill the blood of anyone who saw them. Actually, that might be the reason you sometimes hear a cracking sound behind you, since his jaw can be a bit noisy at times. It's also possible to hear faint hissing sounds. But that's probably because he's desperately trying to breathe near your neck. Luckily for you, however, it's very difficult to see his eyes. But it's not impossible either, I assure you. In fact, he also has the ability to hide from you. For example, when you look at your reflection in a mirror. Or when you walk past a store window and, subtly, you take a look at the product displayed behind the glass. But, as I told you earlier, it's not perfect. I imagine that a lot of people have already experienced seeing a strange silhouette in the television screen right after turning it off around midnight. Maybe it's even possible that you've already seen it while looking at yourself in the mirror. You know, like some kind of shadow in the hallway right before your bathroom door, just behind you. Yet so many of us feel the signs of its presence, but our ability to demystify takes over as we get older. We start walking under ladders without fearing that it brings bad luck. We even break mirrors without being afraid of that year of suffering. That's how we are. We have to reassure ourselves, don't we? But luckily for you, I'm going to reveal to you a way to feel his presence more often. Even better, a way to have a better chance of catching his gaze, for example. It's very simple, you'll see. But first let me explain to you a little bit about who he is. Chilote mythology gives him the name Pachen. The Pachen is able to take the form of anything he wants, since he is completely metamorphic. As you can see, he doesn't really disappear. When you move around, it's possible that he takes the form of a spider by hiding in the collar of your shirt. Even better, he could take the form of a tiny ant to hide on your calf, just under your jeans. He is always there, always by your side. He likes to materialize in his favorite form, that of the creature with the gaping jaw. Only when you sleep, and of course also when you are alone. He enjoys doing that in the evening, also when night has fallen. It's a bit like when you come home and take off your shoes. You get it, I know. Do you want me to tell you how to see it more easily? So I have some really good news for you. You don't have to do anything. In fact, all it took was just a very small thing, very subtle, very simple, to finally have the chance to really feel Pechen near you, or to have the possibility to see him. This one condition was to hear about him, to hear someone say his name to you, to hear someone describe him to you, to hear someone to explain to you that all the noises you heard at night were not just your imagination. To hear someone explain to you that you weren't hallucinating. When you felt someone watching you in the middle of the night, it's confirmed. Now you will finally have the chance to meet the one who has been following you since the very beginning of your life. And I'm glad to have been the one who opened your eyes to him. But I'm sure he will be even more pleased than I am to greet you personally. To that, I'll add a piece of advice. Just one and only, be careful when you turn around, because he's right behind you.
I am here.
This story began when my longtime friend, Henri, became interested in the paranormal. He would spend hours sitting and reading accounts from people who had come into contact with spirits, creatures, and all sorts of entities like that. But what interested him the most were the rituals. He spent his time talking about this practice where people would follow step-by-step scary instructions they found on the internet. and which had rather questionable results and consequences. In general, the rewards were supposed to be worth it. One day, however, he came across an elixir that was made from basic herbs. But when they were ingested, they allowed the person who took them to travel beyond the earthly and human plane. Basically, the person would fall into a trance, where they would be able to communicate with those who had died and those who never had the chance to exist. I was pretty open-minded about it, and I told myself that as long as he wasn't hurting himself, it didn't bother me. To be honest, I even found it amusing. However, when Henry suggested that he wanted to make this elixir, I was extremely skeptical. I felt like it was going to kill him by poisoning him or completely mess up his brain. But he kept insisting on the fact that he had seen a lot of people on YouTube make this mixture and ingest it, and so that I had nothing to worry about. I gave up on it, but Henri insisted that I had to be there when he took the elixir. I didn't refuse. I thought it was better that way, that he had a friend around him in case things went wrong and he had to go to the hospital. On the big day, he was particularly nervous. His skin was slightly pale and he was trembling. Cold sweat was dripping down his face. He insisted that he was fine and told me that he had already made the elixir. He called it the potion of verdade, which in Spanish meant the potion of truth. Since he was afraid of hallucinating and losing his mind, we decided that he would take the potion in the forest behind his house, so that his parents wouldn't totally panic. We arrived at the place we had planned, and Henry took the elixir. The elixir was as brown as mud, but not as thick, and the smell was really strange. The only way I can describe that smell is to compare it to the smell you get. Just before getting a nosebleed, Henry forced himself to swallow the liquid, and his face twisted in disgust. He swallowed it with difficulty, then we sat in silence for a good 10 seconds. We looked at each other, and Henry shrugged before looking around. And a few seconds later, he fell backward, his eyes wide open. I immediately checked his vital signs and saw that everything looked normal. I didn't feel like he was completely unconscious. His eyes were moving from right to left, and his heart was racing. He tried to scream, but all that came out of his mouth was a faint little sound. Before Henry took the substance, he asked me to wait 20 minutes before calling emergency services if something went wrong. His heart might have been beating fast, but it didn't seem to be a life-threatening problem. After 10 minutes of what really looked like paralysis, Henri suddenly came back to himself. He sat up and stared at me, his tear-filled eyes wide open, and he only said one sentence, "I saw them." I immediately asked who he was talking about, but it was as if he couldn't answer me. To be honest, I think it's more because he simply wasn't able to. I felt like he wasn't inside his body anymore. His eyes looked empty, and his skin was even paler than before. I thought the elixir was messing up his system, so I took him to the hospital. The doctors ran some tests, but they didn't find anything. So I came to the conclusion that it wasn't because of the substance that he was like that, but because his mind wasn't even halfway there. I stayed by his side for what felt like days, even though in reality, it only took a few hours before he said something. In a weak and trembling voice, he said to me, "Ryan, please, make it go away." Since those were the first words he had spoken in over 5 hours. So I quickly replied to him, "What? What are you talking about, Henri?" He looked at me with his empty eyes and said, "The thing that didn't exist." Then he lost consciousness again, but never woke up. For the next 2 days, he was diagnosed as being in a coma. He didn't say anything and didn't move an inch, he just stayed still. His skin, which was once so radiant, was now much paler. His lips, on the other hand, were completely blue. I felt like the room was particularly cold as well, not a freezing cold, but an absence of warmth. It was almost as if the warmth of the room was gradually being sucked away. After a while, it really caught my attention, and I kept looking toward the coldest spot in the room. And every time I did, I got a knot in my stomach, like something was staring at me angrily. Eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. I walked up to the spot and reached out my hand. What I felt is almost indescribable. My arm stretched out, and I felt like it was losing all its warmth, all its vitality. When I looked at my arm, there was a line on my skin. On one side it had turned blue, but on the other, I still had my usual tanned complexion. I lowered my arm, but it didn't change anything, and even now it's still the same. I looked into the icy abyss, and suddenly I noticed that something was staring at me with small red eyes. That thing wasn't looking me in the eyes. No, I felt like it was staring at another part of me that our eyes can't see. I left the room and sat down behind the door. I could feel the heat from the hallway rushing under the door at an incredible speed. To get sucked in by that thing. I looked through the glass in the door and saw a dark figure leaning over Henry. The figure was a bit transparent, but it was definitely real. The thing had long arms and long legs, and its back was hunched. Its face was long but deformed, and its ears were pointed like those of an animal. But the thing that shocked me the most about this creature was its multiple mouths filled with sharp teeth. What happened next I still can't believe. As the figure became clearer and clearer, it opened its mouths and it looked like it was sucking in what seemed to be some kind of white vapor coming directly from Henry's body. After what felt like an eternity, I noticed that there was no more white vapor coming out of Henry's body. His head fell to the side and I saw him take his last breath. Henry was dead, the monster had won. Now his body was completely opaque. The creature let out a strange growl and turned its head toward me. Our eyes met and I felt paralyzed. It didn't last long, but I'll never be able to forget any of it. After that, the thing jumped out of Henry's bedroom window and disappeared. When Henry crossed over to the other side of the earthly plane, he was followed by one of those horrible spirits, whose wickedness prevented them from joining our world. They apparently feed on souls. Henry didn't want any of this, but unfortunately, he gave a physical form to a horrible monster. So, if I have one piece of advice to give you, it's to be very careful when you feel a slight cool breeze. Because it might be that the thing is in the same room as you. In life, I have always felt terribly alone. To begin with, I never knew my mother. According to my father, who raised me alone, she left both of us just after I was born. I guess that had a big impact on my life, and because of that event, I've always preferred being alone. But isolation also means loneliness. And paradoxically, loneliness weighs on me more and more, especially since I went through that horrible experience. My father inherited a lake when my grandfather died, who also disappeared shortly after I was born. According to my father, illness took him after a long battle lasting several months. This lake is located not far from our house, in the surrounding mountains. And my father and I loved spending time there. Sometimes, it was a way to enjoy our vacation at a lower cost. Being located several meters above sea level, it's quite cold there, but that's not a problem. Because a small house equipped with a bathroom, a toilet, and a bedroom is located not far from the lake's dock. And of course, we turned on the heaters beforehand so we could enjoy our vacation in warmth. Last week, I decided to spend a weekend there, just to recharge a bit. My work at the office was starting to weigh on me more and more. And the extra work I was given to do afterwards convinced me even more that I really needed a vacation. The family lake seemed like the right place to clear my head, but that was before the horrible event I was about to experience there. On the first day, I had a hard time letting go of the stress. I spent the day reading, watching television, and walking around the lake. Then, to end the day, I took a bath around 11 o'clock. The little cottage was perfectly heated, and I was able to enjoy a few minutes of peace in the bathwater, before something pulled me out of my bliss. The bathroom windows were made of frosted glass, so it was hard to see what the weather was like outside. But despite the blur of the window, I had no trouble seeing what was behind it at that moment. A dark figure, that of a woman standing in front of the window. Her hair was long and black, and even though I couldn't make out the features of her face, I could see the bluish color of her skin. Her hands were positioned right in front of her face, as if to help her see better inside the room. My eyes wide with terror, I started to open my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. Instead, I saw her right hand rise to gently tap against the glass. I still don't know how I managed to find the energy to do what I did next. But I got out of the bathtub, wrapped a towel around my waist, and rushed out of the room. Then I opened the front door of the house, not even caring about the cold night air because adrenaline was rushing through my body. I immediately looked toward the bathroom window, but no one was there. I put on my slippers and decided to walk around the house to try to find that person. But after a few minutes of searching, I didn't find any clues suggesting that someone could have been there in front of my window. I swallowed hard and started asking myself a lot of questions. I felt like the tension I experienced at work had followed me all the way to the lake. And that, because of this, my mind was playing tricks on me. And as I rubbed my face, trying to put things into perspective as much as possible, I saw him again. I was so busy looking around the house that I forgot to check near the lake, only... If I had looked around it, I wouldn't have seen anything either. Because the figure wasn't around the lake, nor on the dock. In fact, no. Because it was in the middle of the lake and floating a few centimeters above the water. While my brain struggled to process this sudden information, I tried to take a step back. Unfortunately, this gesture clearly didn't please the female figure because the next moment she let out a horrible scream. Her scream was a kind of mix between despair and anger, and never in my life had I heard anything like it. I immediately ran as far away from that thing as I could, trying to gather all the strength I had left to lock myself in the house with the door double locked. Obviously, I'm not one of those horror movie heroes, so I didn't try to confront the horrible ghost from the lake. No, I preferred to quickly gather my things to get ready to leave this place as soon as possible. But I had barely had time to gather my things when I heard a voice rising from behind the front door. In the lake. My paralysis suddenly returned after hearing those words. The problem wasn't that a possible ghostly entity had spoken to me directly, but rather the tone of its voice. In that voice, I felt something like melancholy, a deep sorrow. I suddenly had the feeling that I needed to listen to it. But my fearful mind quickly took over again, so I kept packing the rest of my few belongings into the suitcase. Shortly after, I found myself stuck in front of the front door again. I was absolutely terrified of running into the ghost of the lake again. After all, just a few moments earlier, she was behind the front door, talking to me directly. So, I quietly walked toward one of the windows that looked directly out onto the lake. Not surprisingly, she was still there, not behind the door, but in the middle of the lake. She floated ominously above it. This time, she wasn't facing me, but was standing in profile. While her right hand was pointing at something, I had to squint to see what she was trying to show me. And that thing was the lake itself. Her finger was pointing directly at the surface of the water. But I thought I knew what she wanted to show me. It was probably the bottom of the lake. After a moment of watching her, her head slowly turned toward me. She knew I was watching her. And that, despite the distance between her and me, I squinted again to try to see more. And it was at that very moment that I was able to see the features of her face for the very first time. And quickly, I was able to confirm the feeling I had earlier. Those features seemed to radiate deep sorrow. She even looked like she was about to cry. At the time, I didn't understand why, but I felt immense empathy at that moment. And right after closing the curtain, I opened the front door to see more clearly what was happening. But she had completely disappeared. I never saw her again after that night. And the horrible event that followed that sudden encounter will continue to haunt me for the rest of my days. I was able to find in the city archives a list of people who have gone missing over the past 30 years. And by searching thoroughly, I eventually came across this woman, Elsa Wilson. She was the spitting image of the lake's ghost, and I quickly made the connection between the events at the lake and her disappearance. I managed to gather a small team of divers by pretending that I had lost something valuable in the lake while fishing. And unsurprisingly, they found Elsa's body. Her hands were tied behind her back, and a huge rock was attached around her waist and ankles with a thick metal chain. I was quickly removed from the case due to her advanced state of decomposition. Because yes, I was still just a child when Elsa was reported missing. At the time, the lake belonged to only two people, my father and my grandfather. Access to it was much more difficult since, according to old family photos, I could see that it was surrounded by tall fences and barbed wire. To prevent possible thefts, the police are always trying to find out who is responsible. Even though I have my own idea. Although I refuse to admit it, it seems that my father is behind this horrible murder. But worse than anything, I'm finally starting to understand why I felt that horrible empathy for Elsa, who wouldn't feel this deep sadness in front of the ghosts of her own mother.